The next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Good afternoon, you're watching The Discussion with me, Inaya Folarin Iman, where we discuss the big moral, cultural and political questions of our time. I'm joined in the studio throughout the show by writer Poppy Coburn. On this week's show, we bring you the latest analysis on the war in Ukraine. Also, we explore the morality of nuclear weapons. Next, will Elon Musk save free speech? And as today marks the 25 years since Tony Blair's landslide election victory in 1997, we examine the former Prime Minister's legacy. But first is the latest news.
Good afternoon. It's 3 o'clock. Here's the latest in the newsroom. GB News can reveal hundreds of people on board multiple small boats have been intercepted in the English Channel by UK authorities today. It follows 11 days in which no small boats made it into British waters. Since first light, at least 7 vessels have been spotted and intercepted. At least 230 people have now been taken to the UK Border Force's processing centre in Dover. The United Nations has confirmed that efforts are underway to evacuate civilians from a steelworks in Mariupol. A spokesperson says Operation Safe Passage is being coordinated with Ukrainian and Russian officials. An estimated 54 people have already been taken to a temporary accommodation centre in the Donetsk region. Meanwhile, President Zelensky says Russian attacks in the east continue.
The occupiers are gathering additional forces for new attacks against our military in the east of the country. Russia has brought reinforcements in the Kharkiv region, trying to increase pressure in the Donbas. They've lost more than 23,000 soldiers in the battles of this senseless war, but they do not stop.
Here in the UK, a series of bullying and sexual misconduct allegations involving MPs in Parliament has seen women working in Westminster share stories of harassment. Commons Speaker Sir Lindsay Hoyle is calling for radical reform to make the House safer and more inclusive. It's after MP Neil Parish resigned after being caught watching pornography in the Commons. Chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Tom Tugendhat, says the problem is bigger than Westminster alone.
You know, I don't think you need to be told what you could and couldn't look at on your mobile phone in a workplace, Alistair. I mean, you know, you're a grown-up, you know the basic rules of society. I don't think it's that hard. And I just think we need to be a little bit more respectful to each other and just remember that in the whole of society, I'm afraid misogyny is still far too much of an issue and we need to address it together.
While Tory party chairman Oliver Dowden says the Conservative Party will make sure its candidate list becomes more representative. He told the Sunday Telegraph it should reflect the fact that half the population are women. Around a quarter of Tory candidates at the 2019 election were women, but Labour managed more than half. Culture Secretary Nadine Dorries says ensuring a majority of women in Parliament could help tackle Westminster sleaze. The May Day marches are getting underway in London. Members of the public have joined trade union members calling for help for workers struggling to manage the cost of living crisis. The TUC says they need stronger wage bargaining rights and is calling on the government to introduce an emergency budget to give direct support with rising bills. Meanwhile, interest rates are expected to be increased on Thursday to their highest level for 13 years. Economists predict the Bank of England will increase rates from 0.75% to 1%, a number not seen since early 2009. Members of the bank's Monetary Policy Committee have raised rates at each of its past 3 meetings as part of attempts to rein in record inflation. It comes as the war in Ukraine adds to the ongoing cost of living crisis. The Business Secretary has written to North Sea oil and gas firms asking them to come up with a plan to increase domestic production. Kwasi Kwarteng says the industry must invest in homegrown energy production to boost the British economy and bring down consumer bills in the long term. He said firms must also set out plans for investment in clean energy ahead of a meeting in the coming weeks. And COVID guidance in Scotland has changed from today. Those with the virus no longer need to self-isolate, but are still being advised to stay at home. Contact tracing has also come to an end as cases of the virus continue to fall. The number of COVID infections has dropped for the 5th successive week, with about 1 in 25 people having COVID. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's return to Inaya.
It's day 67 of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The Ministry of Defence say 8,000 British troops will engage in military exercises across Eastern Europe to combat Russian aggression. It's one of the biggest deployments since the Cold War. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Russia is trying to ramp up pressure on Ukrainian forces in the eastern Donbas region and has said Ukraine was doing everything to ensure a mission is carried out to evacuate hundreds of stranded civilians and fighters from the southern city of Mariupol. And as US Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi makes a surprise visit to Kiev, will Western moral support for Ukraine maintain? Where are we in the stage of the conflict and what are the options for Ukraine? Well, joining me now is Olga Tokaryuk, a journalist and SIPA non-resident. Thank you so much for joining me, Olga. Are you, if I'm right, you're in Ukraine right now?
Hello, yes, I'm in Western Ukraine.
Yes, so could you tell me the latest from where you are?
Well, this part of Ukraine where I am is relatively safe. And actually, this is the part that is also visited very often by foreign dignitaries and even showbiz stars. For example, yesterday, Angelina Jolie, Hollywood diva, visited the city of Lviv, not too far from where I am. But the rest of the country, of course, is, where the events are happening, where the fighting is happening. As you mentioned, in Mariupol, an effort is underway to evacuate hundreds of civilians civilians and Ukrainian soldiers who are stuck at the Mariupol steel mill, Azovstal. Also this weekend, and it will last for almost 3 days, a curfew was imposed in Odessa, in the city on the southern part of the country on the Black Sea. As you know, Russian escalation is expected there. Odessa has been hit by Russian missiles before, and more attacks might be coming. This is the warning coming from the Ukrainian officials. And also in Kharkiv, in the eastern part of the country, on the border, like Kharkiv is located just 40 kilometers from the Russian border. All residents were advised to stay in the shelters, in the bomb shelters for the whole day today, because there is a very high risk of Russian shelling and bombardments.
And the UK and other countries are deploying troops to Eastern Europe. Is there a sense amongst the Ukrainian leadership, in your understanding, that the Western support is enough, or that more should be done, or what do you think?
Well, I think we've seen a massive, change of stance by many Western countries on the military support to Ukraine. And we are seeing that not only the US and the UK, who were among the first to provide military support to Ukraine, but also other countries are now joining this effort. The Netherlands said they will be supplying heavy military equipment to Ukraine. And from Germany, the encouraging signals are coming. This, as you know, Germany was the country who was one of the most reluctant to provide military assistance to Ukraine, but this position is changing. So, of course, there is a sense of appreciation here in Ukraine that, Ukraine is receiving the support it's asking for, the military support is asking for. But, of course, also financial aid is needed, humanitarian aid is needed. And, I have to say, I've been working on an article recently about a post-war reconstruction, how Ukrainians are already preparing to rebuild their country. And, there are already plans underway. There are people working on that. And what everybody here, I think, expects also a participation of our partners, of all the, people across the world who are now standing with Ukraine in this post-war reconstruction effort. We already have to start thinking about that, thinking about how much money we will need for that, who will do what, and how we will rebuild Ukraine after this war is over.
On that point, Olga, some people have suggested that a Marshall Plan type of effort will be needed in order to build Ukraine from America, from the EU and other Western countries and organisations, in the tune of millions, billions, if not trillions, in order to support rebuilding Ukraine in the future.
Yes, the Marshall Plan is something that, is being discussed both here in Ukraine and outside. According to the figures by the Ukrainian government, the losses so far to Ukraine's economy because of war amount to $600 billion. This is a massive amount, considering that the war is not yet over and that Russians are continuing to destroy Ukrainian infrastructure, targeting, for example, airports. Just yesterday, an airport in Odessa was hit by Russian missiles with the tarmac completely destroyed. So, the bill is growing every day. So, of course, a huge effort would be needed to rebuild Ukraine. But I think it is important already, to start thinking about that, to start making plans, because Ukrainians definitely are not going to give up. They are going to resist. They are going to fight. And one day, I'm sure of that, Ukraine will win.
And just finally, some people, even Boris Johnson a couple of weeks ago, expressed that the war could continue to perhaps even the end of next year. I mean, do you worry that this war will continue for potentially years to come?
Well, I certainly hope it won't, as I think many Ukrainians do. It's already, underway for more than 2 months. Hopefully it will not take years to finish this war. For that, also, I think more painful sanctions are needed to be imposed on Russia, an embargo on Russian oil, an embargo on Russian gas, in order to cripple Russian economy, in order to stop the flow of money to Russian war machine. So it is also, I think, how long this war will last. This also depends on the resolve of the West, on the resolve of Ukraine's partners, in terms not only of their support to Ukraine, but also on the costs they impose for Russia.
Well, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon, Olga Tokayu, journalist and SIPA non-resident. Thank you so much. Very interesting. Well, I am joined now also by Richard Johnson, lecturer in US politics and policy. Thank you so much for joining me, Richard. I mean, just listening to some of the things that Olga mentioned there, I mean, do you worry that Western support may wane? So, for example, originally many countries in Europe, such as France and Germany, rejected Russia's demand to be paid in rubles for oil and gas, but there has been some reports that have suggested that some companies have already been doing that. I mean, do you think that Western resolve will maintain, or it may fracture?
I think by and large at the moment Western resolve has been maintained, and in fact has been better perhaps than we might have expected. I mean, I remember back at the very start of this conflict where Joe Biden was talking about, you know, almost advising Zelensky to flee the country and find safe harbor out there. And the Biden administration, I think in particular, has really upped the ante, in a sense, has really said now, look, I thought it was very interesting what Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary, said in Poland, where he said, actually, we need to stop Putin from being able to do this ever again. So the US is taking a strong lead. There is the point about Germany, which you mentioned. And I think there is something, Germany is almost a unique or outlier case here, which deserves attention for sure. But I don't think that we should use Germany as the litmus test of the West's resolve in this conflict.
And as I mentioned in the introduction, that the UK and other countries are deploying troops to Eastern Europe in order to fend off Russian aggression. I mean, do you think that this may be the start of the dial moving, wherein actually countries within the West actually open up the possibility of more serious intervention, potentially, in Ukraine?
There has been an escalation, and every escalation carries risks. And I think we have to be aware of what those risks can be, particularly with a power like Russia, which has shown an openness about chemical weapons and even idle talk about nuclear weapons. Now, I don't think we should use that talk to prevent us from taking a stand here. And I think actually what we heard from the previous guest and what we've heard from so many Ukrainians is the Ukrainians have made the case very obvious for the West in terms of where to stand and what we should be doing, which is supporting them in their struggle. Now, that doesn't mean that you're reckless, and you realize that every time that you escalate, you have to consider what the potential risks are. But it doesn't mean that you think, well, if there is a risk, we don't escalate. And I think that at the moment, there is still a feeling that Ukraine can be victorious here in some fashion. And so I think as long as that remains a possibility, I think that it's reasonable for the West to be showing its full support.
And finally, I mean, you touched upon it in the sense of to make sure that Russia never does something like this again. We've seen a Russian state television and also Putin essentially talking up the possibility of using nuclear weapons. I mean, how on earth could they ever come back into the international community with such a grotesque and unjustified violation, you know, of the international order and Ukrainian sovereignty? It does seem that Russia has set themselves on a path, unleashed a chain of events to which will lead to their marginalisation almost indefinitely from the global community.
The thing is that Russia should have learned this lesson after Crimea, and it clearly didn't in 2014. And that was something I think, you know, particularly, again, with following Joe Biden on this, Biden now, I think, accepts that the Obama administration just didn't act strongly enough to make it clear to Russia that what it did in Crimea was unacceptable. Now the international community is doing that. I agree in terms of what's the path back. I think for Putin himself, becoming fully reintegrated into the kind of status that he once had I think that's off the table. You know, he won't be leader of Russia forever. You know, he's been there since 1999. There's some reports that he has some emerging health issues. This isn't to say that he's about to go, but you know, maybe this is after a decade from now. Is Putin still really going to be at the helm in Russia? I think that feels unlikely. So there is a way for Russia back, but it's actually really what the post-Putin leadership is. Now, people are being careful about talking about that because then Putin gets quite anxious when he hears about the post-Putin future. But I think, that's what we, to ourselves, need to be thinking about in terms of Russia's reintegration into the international system.
Well, thank you so much, Richard Johnson, lecturer in US politics and policy at Queen Mary, University of London. Thank you for joining me this afternoon. I'm still joined in the studio by Poppy Coburn, writer and journalist, and I just wanted to get a quick reaction from you about some of the things that was said. I mean, what's your sense in terms of Western increased support, militarily potentially, for Ukraine? I mean, this may well be one of the first conflicts our generation has really lived through.
Yeah, I think that's actually quite an interesting question. In terms of moral leadership, I think the way that this conflict has played out has been quite unexpected for Western powers. There was very much from our intelligence briefings from both the UK and the US, the expectation that Ukraine would fall very quickly under a Russian assault, and that's not been the case at all. And I think in large part you can put that down to the charismatic leadership of the leader of the country, Volodymyr Zelensky, who has been absolutely crucial in driving up Western support. Obviously, we're now seeing Germany getting involved, as we've discussed earlier. But I think we also have to be somewhat cautious when we're talking about how we as a country are going to get involved and try and think as strategically as we possibly can. So there's talk about a Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was instituted by the US when it was such a powerful economy. It was the predominant economy of the post-World War II landscape. That is not Britain. We are quite weak economically. We are not a power player on the world stage. And I just think we should be careful with how we're posturing because, frankly, we just don't have those resources to throw around. So, moral consideration, give as much support as we possibly can, but we have to be strategic here.
Well, thank you. Poppy, we'll get more reaction from you as the show goes on. Well, in other news, corporate censorship has been a thorny issue for libertarians who, on the one hand, support freedom of expression, but on the other, recognise the right of private companies such as Twitter to remove content and users for whatever reason they wish, even if it creates a culture that stifles inquiry. This week, news broke that Tesla founder Elon Musk had purchased the social media platform Twitter, wherein he vows to take steps to turn Twitter into a censorship-free digital town square. But many have pointed out that Musk's own track record doesn't exactly confirm him as a free speech absolutist, as he likes to frame himself as, and suggested that his motives in making the purchase might have more to do with promoting his own company's investments and himself than with protecting free speech. So our question today is, can Elon Musk save free speech, or are people looking for a silver bullet that isn't coming? Well, joining me now in the studio is Ralph Leonard, writer, and also Sasha White, contributor at Tablet Magazine and founder of Plebiscite. So I'll just start with you, Ralph. Thank you so much for joining me. I mean, what's your reaction? Do you think that Elon Musk can save free speech? Because actually, sometimes I think, free speech, or the problem of free speech in society, is an institution-wide, is a cultural problem. Can one person be that silver bullet?
No. In my opinion, Elon Musk owning free speech is plus ça change. The more things change, the more things stay the same. Because the problem with social media and free speech is more structural than any one individual who owns it and their personal politics. So, because social media is a immense public sphere where billions of people are in this common space where they can make personal connections and engage in democratic debate. But it is owned by private companies who impose their own rules without any consistency or transparency, and that's where the problem of free speech comes in, and why you have all these inconsistent censorship. Why does this person get banned but this person doesn't? And that's the fundamental question that should be interrogated, instead of whether Elon Musk can save the day against Jack Dorsey or whatever.
Would you agree with that, Poppy? Because, I think that there's a really interesting point that actually is a question of transparency, clear rules applied in a way that is consistent, that, and not kind of political. Because, when you see Elon Musk on Twitter, he's almost trying to own the libs or whatever. And is it healthy that we're swapping one partisan, a CEO for another? We just want clear, consistent rules.
I think you're completely right to point out there's no silver bullet to this question. And Elon Musk is a bit of a huckster. You know, he likes to joke around. He likes this public persona as being like this free speech champion. But ultimately, the real threat to online free speech isn't coming from tech billionaires. It's actually coming from our own government. There's a piece of legislation that came out in 2003. It's the Online Malicious Communications Act. And there's a little segment, the 122 segment, and it basically says that you can go to jail if you say things that are potentially harmful online. Now, that legislation is a lot worse than what Jack Dorsey is doing. That's the state actually getting involved with freedom of speech. And I think that's the real issue here we need to be talking about, not whatever Elon Musk is playing about with online.
But, Ralph, I mean, how do we create that culture of free speech then? Because people, they kind of look to regulate social media in the government's defence because, you know, they don't really know what else to do. They don't know how to initiate tolerance within society or encourage that in people's hearts and minds. So they're kind of technological determinists. They think that actually if you just tinker around the edges on technology, that will be the solution. I mean, where is the solution then to what seems to be a growing culture of self-censorship, to say the least?
I think, well, this is a very difficult question because, you know, how do you change a culture? Like, it takes changing the culture one way takes decades, and then reversing it takes decades as well. I think it does have to start with what Poppy, I think, says, sort of at least dealing with legislation from the state, such as the Online Communications Act, and because that's fundamentally where, if you like, the question of free speech starts. What can the state stop you from saying? And I think, in my opinion, that the state shouldn't stop you from saying very much unless, you know, there is, like, you know, direct incitement to violence or criminal activity. I think once you start there, then you can get onto the more difficult cultural questions, which does involve, you know, private companies and what society says you can or cannot say. What, you know, John Stuart Mill called the tyranny of custom.
Oh, indeed. Well, thank you. Well, it seems the consensus here is that Elon cannot save free speech. Well, thank you so much, Ralph Leonard, writer, and Poppy Coburn, who will be giving us more reaction as the show goes on. Well, after the break, we'll be discussing the morality of nuclear weapons. And as today marks 25 years since Tony Blair's landslide of election victory in 1997, we examine the former Prime Minister's legacy. Also, will the culture wars impact how you vote in the next local elections? Just after the break.
Looking ahead to this afternoon. And
Ralph, hey, are you staying in London right now?
No, I'll be...
Oh, did you come all the way?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. What?
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, Matt. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Today marks the 25th anniversary of the election of Tony Blair's new Labour government. The three-time Prime Minister is often derided today, but his premiership fundamentally altered the direction of Britain. From taking this country into Iraq in 2003 to mass immigration, tuition fees, NHS reform, devolution and the national minimum wage. It is clear that the legacy of Blair's government continues to shape British politics. Thus, how should we view the Blair era, and in what way does his legacy impact today's politics? I'm joined now by Graham Stewart, the Deputy Editor of The Critic. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon, Graham. Firstly, what's your reaction to the 25th anniversary of the landslide victory of Tony Blair?
Well, I remember it well. I was trying to think back in May 1997, trying to think of any good reason why I should still vote Conservative. John Major's government had given me very few reasons to do so. But I did vote Conservative because I thought a Tony Blair government would achieve two things which I didn't want. The first would be that it would take Britain into the euro, and that would have made any future Brexit very difficult to achieve if we had a monetary union as well as a customs union. And the second is I thought it would have electoral reform and introduce proportional representation with the intent of creating an almost permanent kind of liberal progressive government of Labour and Liberal Democrats. And of course, neither of those two things came to pass. So when we think about what was achieved and what the legacies were, we should always perhaps ponder what might have happened and didn't happen. And I think one of the interesting aspects of Tony Blair's legacy is that of unintended consequences, unintended even to what Tony Blair himself would have wished. And that's the framework in which it's sometimes, I think, quite good to look at the 10 years of the Blair years.
And what do you think about the reaction that people have when he does make his interventions into the public debate? You know, people are quick to call him a war criminal and all of these labels. But the reality is he did win 3 elections, so he was very popular at the time. And so what do you make of how that perception of him seems to have changed?
Well, it's interesting. He seems to be less popular now amongst Labour voters than amongst people, including myself, who never voted for him at the time. I think for those on the left, there's a sense that 10 years in power is a good opportunity to do things, and that he didn't achieve what they would have liked him to have achieved. Many of the real legacies of Tony Blair should, I think, perhaps be seen in the so-called heir to Blair, David Cameron's term of government. And if he has a legacy, in some ways, it's David Cameron's government. But of course, invariably, Afghanistan and Iraq overshadow the Blair years. It went catastrophically wrong, even in Tony Blair's own terms. It went catastrophically wrong, even if he still justifies, at least to himself, the reasons for taking the decisions he did. So every prime minister after their time goes through a period of unpopularity, and then there's a reevaluation. I think in time, people will accept that in Britain, at least, the Blair years were relatively peaceful. We should give credit, I think, to his role, although started by John Major, his role in ending the Troubles in Northern Ireland, although that story obviously is ongoing. We may, in a matter of days, have a Sinn Féin-led administration. But that, along with a decade of economic growth, again, not entirely of Gordon Brown's doing. Gordon Brown is Chancellor, but a decade of economic growth always creates some positive legacies in terms of investments and opportunities that growth encourages.
And finally, I mean, what do you make of how it seems that Blair has taken the somewhat anti-woke side of a lot of the cultural debates on the trans issue and so on, but actually other people would say, well, he's partly responsible for some of these cultural divides, such as over Brexit and mass immigration, hate crime legislation, and the consequences of hyper-globalization, where people that perhaps weren't advantaged from that change within society just had to get with the programme. I mean, what do you make of how he seems to have changed tack, or at least appears to have?
Well, I think he should take better ownership of a process he helped to commence, not just on cultural issues, but across a whole range of issues. The Gender Recognition Act came in 2004 under his watch. That in no way ended the debate between biological sex and gender, as the most cursory glance on Twitter will tell you. But in a host of other areas as well, he's totally failed to solve any of the problems. Particularly, I'm thinking in terms of constitutional reform. Devolution, particularly in Scotland, was supposed to kill nationalism stone dead, as George Robertson, the Labour politician, said at the time. In fact, nationalism has never been stronger. Then, in a whole host of other areas, really, Tony Blair has kick-started processes which, even judged by his own criteria, have failed abysmally.
Well, thank you so much, Graham Stewart, Deputy Editor of The Critic. Thank you. Well, after the break, we'll be discussing the morality of nuclear weapons and whether the culture wars will impact how you vote in next week's local election. But first, it's the bulletins.
Good afternoon. It's 3:34. I'm Olivia Guthrie in the GB newsroom. The United Nations has confirmed that efforts are underway to evacuate civilians from a steelworks in Mariupol. A spokesperson says Operation Safe Passage is being coordinated with Ukrainian and Russian officials. An estimated 54 people have already been taken to a temporary accommodation centre in the Donetsk region. GB News can reveal hundreds of people on board multiple small boats have been intercepted by UK authorities in the English Channel today. It follows 11 days in which no small boats made it into British waters. Since first light, at least 7 vessels have been spotted and intercepted. At least 230 people have now been taken to the UK Border Forces Processing Centre in Dover. A series of bullying and sexual misconduct allegations involving MPs in Parliament has seen women working in Westminster share stories of harassment. Commons Speaker Sir Lindsay Hoyle is today calling for radical reform to make the House safer and more inclusive. It's after MP Neil Parish resigned after being caught watching pornography in the Commons. The May Day marches are getting underway in London. Members of the public have joined trade union members calling for help for workers struggling to tackle the cost of living crisis. The TUC says it needs stronger wage bargaining rights and the government should introduce an emergency budget to give direct support with surging bills. COVID guidance in Scotland has changed from today. Those with the virus no longer need to self-isolate, but are still being advised to stay at home. Contact tracing has also come to an end as case numbers continue to fall. Dozens of people are still missing after a residential building in China collapsed. 6 people have been rescued and pulled from the debris of an 8-storey block in the Hunan province. Firefighters have now been searching for survivors for 52 hours. You're up to date for now. There's plenty more at the top of the hour.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's 2 questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back. Just before we go to the next section, just quick reaction from you, Poppy, in terms of the legacy of Blair, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. We're all technically Blair's heirs. I don't really think you can talk about Tony Blair as if he's this spent political force. I think the greatest impact he's had on British politics is through his legislation. So, we can all go off and rank all the terrible things Blair's done, the expansion of universities, the politicisation of Whitehall, unrestrained immigration, all sorts of things, not to even mention the Iraq War. But I think really his legacy here is through the Conservative government. Just as Thatcher, brought in some anti-trade union legislation, which then followed through to Tony Blair. There's no hard and fast, breakage between these two governments. And I think, unfortunately, the Conservative Party can't really talk about how awful Blair is when most of his legislation is still on the books. And if anything, we've actually expanded on Blair's legacy. I don't think Blair, even in his wildest dreams, could have imagined we would have, hundreds of thousands of legal migrants coming into the country every year, that the universities would be cast open in this completely and utterly insane way. So, yeah, we are still living Blair. He's not gone yet.
Well, we'll get more reaction from you as the show goes on, Poppy. Thank you. Well, back to the question or the subject of Ukraine. In his latest chilling speech to legislators on Wednesday, Putin reiterated that Russia will not hesitate to use nuclear weapons if threatened by countries, quote, interfering in Ukraine. Russia's new Sarmat-2 nuclear missile was tested for the first time just days ago. Putin boasted about it being, quote, unlike any other weapon in the world. This has shone a light on an ongoing debate. Some take Putin's threat as yet another sign that possession of nuclear weapons do not enhance a country's security, but are a rather immoral tool that encourage the destruction and imperil other nations across the world, and therefore should be banned. Others, however, have instead expressed relief that the repeated campaigns to abandon Britain's nuclear deterrent were unsuccessful, so as were unsuccessful as to not, if we did not have nuclear weapons, and this would have made Russia's attacks against the UK more likely. In this week's episode of Moral Dilemmas, we then discuss the morality of nuclear weapons. So I'm joined now by Paul Ingram, Academic Programme Manager and Senior Research Associate at the Centre of the Study of Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge, and Patrick Porter, Fellow at Freesat and from the University of International Security at the University of Birmingham. Thank you so much for joining me both. Firstly, I'll start with you, Paul. I mean, on the introduction that I just mentioned, some people are arguing that actually, if it wasn't for nuclear weapons, then Putin would be doing much more than he's currently doing now, given that he doesn't care about international rules.
Well, it could easily well be argued the other way, that if there were no nuclear weapons involved at all, NATO would be on the side of Ukraine and pushing Russia out as we speak. Of course, the issue here is who has the nuclear weapons and how they're used and what sort of morality there is behind that. So Russia is attempting to invade Ukraine under the protection of its nuclear umbrella. And to some extent, that has caused some sort of hesitation on the part of NATO. If there were serious threats of nuclear reprisals from NATO today, I think we would be getting very close to quite a difficult, challenging and horrific situation. Because let us not forget that even a small number of nuclear weapons being used causes such a global catastrophe that even if all the nuclear weapons used were in and around Ukraine, we would still be experiencing such dramatic climatic effects in this country that we would probably all starve to death. These weapons are extraordinarily powerful and used against cities have global impact.
And Patrick, what's your reaction to what Paul just said?
Well, Paul's right to be worried, but NATO is intervening partly because we do have nuclear weapons, and we feel that we can, as it were, arm and help support the resistance in Ukraine because we are less subject to nuclear blackmail than if we had already disarmed and if Russia had a nuclear monopoly in this situation. Look, nuclear weapons are the most powerful means yet of preventing major power war that society has ever seen. But a much more pragmatic point here is they can't be uninvented. They can't be wished away. We have the choice whether to disarm, but so does the likes of China, Russia, North Korea. And if you're worried about the morality of a world where the West is nuclear armed, it's much more worrisome to have a world where only Xi Jinping and his ilk have them.
And what do you say to that, Paul? Also, some people also suggest that Ukraine had to give up their nuclear weapons. Yes, they were originally Russia's and so on, but actually, perhaps if they didn't give them up, then Russia would be much more cautious in doing what he's doing.
Well, these were weapons that were dependent on Russia and the Soviet Union to function. So I don't think there was any serious probability of Ukraine retaining its own independent nuclear deterrent. However, when it comes to the balance here, I don't think there's a serious political force suggesting that the whole of NATO should give up its nuclear weapons and allow Russia full reign. What we are looking at, though, is the failure of the international community, partly Britain, partly the United States, partly Russia and the other nuclear-armed states, to seriously consider steps down the nuclear ladder. And the experience that we have today is partly as a result of that. People often talk about unilateral nuclear disarmament versus multilateral nuclear disarmament, but the real distinction is between those who are real multilateralists and those who actually like nuclear weapons, because as Patrick is saying, there is this belief that having nuclear weapons means the risk of conventional war is less. I don't believe that. I don't believe that there is a reduced great power effect from nuclear weapons, and I think the war that we're looking at today is testament to that. Now, this is not me saying NATO should get rid of all its nuclear weapons. It's me saying NATO and other nuclear weapon states need to move far more seriously in the direction of nuclear disarmament when the sun shines. So I'm not saying in the next few weeks, because that's not realistic, but I'm saying over the next few years, after this war resolves, we need to be putting far greater effort into that multilateral disarmament. And this was the conclusion of the Trident Commission that I put together, and that it was cross-party.
Patrick, I mean, what do you say to those who say that actually it hasn't been a deterrent, it's made us more unsafe? For example, it's made Western countries more cautious because Russia is threatening to use nuclear weapons, and it's just allowed Russia free rein whilst Western countries have been cautious as fear of escalating.
Well, there's a flip side to that argument. The very force that enables Vladimir Putin to issue nuclear threats and for us, therefore, to do everything short of directly intervening is the same force that would make Vladimir Putin think twice or three times about attacking NATO. Look, we know from history on a number of crisis moments that leaders making decisions were very strongly influenced by the fear of nuclear escalation or even just failing to prevent conventional escalation. Dwight Eisenhower in 1958, the Berlin crisis. India and Pakistan compared their behaviour before and after they acquired nuclear weapons. The wars before, the crises after, absolutely, but much more caution. The Gulf states deciding after 1973 that because Israel possessed nuclear weapons, they couldn't wipe Israel out. Now, to Paul's very challenging point that we need to be moving forward towards greater disarmament, the difficulty there is that if you move to a world of smaller arsenals, much greater, more cautious postures, nuclear deterrence therefore might start to lose its credibility because you start to look like a nuclear reluctant, as in too reluctant ever to use them. And so that comes at a price.
And also, Paul, I mean, some people will say that actually weaponry, conventional weaponry now is so sophisticated that it can do huge damage, and therefore the question of nuclear weapons is almost neither here nor there when it comes to warfare, as we've seen in Ukraine, Russia just flattening cities and in some senses people arguing targeting civilians. It's sophisticated conventional weaponry that's the problem, and actually it's the logic of war is what we should really be arguing against, not necessarily focusing on nuclear weapons.
Well, certainly we should be attempting to escape the logic of war, but nuclear weapons are different in a number of different ways. They are significantly larger, even the smallest nuclear weapon, than the largest conventional weapon. But more importantly, if you have an exchange of nuclear weapons on cities, which is perfectly possible given the doctrines of the nuclear weapon states today, those cities burn. And as they burn, the soot goes up into the atmosphere and has massive climatic effects that no conventional conflict could ever have. And as those cities burn and the climate changes, it takes the carrying capacity, the ability to grow food down to a tiny, tiny fraction of what it was. Even an exchange of 200 or 300 nuclear weapons on 100 or 150 cities would have this effect to the extent that Europe their growing capacity would go down to about 2 or 3% what it is now. That's mass starvation on a scale we've never seen in any world conflict, or would do in any non-nuclear conflict. Yeah. And I think it's also important to see that military technology is not going in that direction. It's going in the direction of smart, targeted, usable technology, not big, unusable, explosive technology.
And just final word to you, Patrick.
Right, so there's one quality of nuclear weapons that Paul didn't mention that makes them truly unique, and that is you can't defend against them. If one gets through, as Paul says, it can have a massive effect. And because they can't be defended against, that creates a stalemate, something we've never seen before between the great powers. You cannot no longer bet that you can attack someone else's country, even if they are weaker than you, and keep your capital city, that you would suffer unacceptable damage. And it's that very imposing thing that's helped keep the peace for 80 years now between great powers.
Well, thank you both for joining me this afternoon. Paul Ingram, Academic Programme Manager and Senior Research Associate at the University of Cambridge, specialising in existential risk, and also Patrick Porter, International Security Expert at the University of Birmingham. Thank you so much. And just before we move on to the last subject, just very, very quick reaction from you, Poppy. What's your thoughts?
Well, I'm afraid I'm going to have to be very cowardly and say that I kind of agree with both the guests equally here. One of my favourite quotes I've ever heard regarding nuclear weaponry has been from Aaron Rapport, and he says, "Nuclear weapons keep us safe until they kill us all." They are an extremely important geopolitical resource in keeping the balance of the great powers together. but they're also these very complex, interconnected systems where the margin of just human error is absolutely catastrophic. You know, I think sometimes it's more likely that we're going to be entering a nuclear hellfire just through accident rather than actual intentional policy. So that's something to think about.
Well, that is indeed a worry. Well, in our final segment, from the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020 to heated debates over transgender rights, discussions about hot-button cultural issues are never far from the headlines. But with the cost of living crisis continuing to squeeze, to what extent will the culture wars influence how voters cross their ballot in the upcoming local elections? I went to find out.
Elections are taking place across the UK on the 5th of May. Voters in England, Wales and Scotland will pick who they want to run services that affect everyday life in their local area. The results are likely to reflect how people feel about Boris Johnson, the Partygate scandal.
Well, sorry about that technical issue. We've had a lot of problems on the show today, but we've thankfully got Poppy to have some really interesting discussions. I mean, what's your thoughts? Do you think that the culture wars will have an impact on how voters will vote in the upcoming local elections?
I mean, I think the thing is, culture wars always have a material base to them. And I've kind of been banging on about this throughout the whole show. So many of the issues we have in Britain today are not just coming out from thin air, they're actually baked into legislation. For example, I think one of the most pernicious cases of terrible legislation that's ruining the country at the moment is the 2010 Equality Act. Now, that is wokeism, you know, but it's wokeism that the Conservative government has not repealed or even attempted to repeal. It came in the outgoing, you know, Brown Labour government, and it essentially mandates things like affirmative action in public sector bodies. That is the culture war, but it's real. And I really just, it irritates me when I see Conservative politicians pushing back against the woke, but they're quite comfortable to let these really pernicious laws stay on the books. So, yeah, I think there's a material base to all of these things.
But I guess, pushing back a little bit, some people will say, well, we have got the cost of living crisis right now, you know, energy bills through the roof. We also have the housing crisis for young people. If you had a party that was saying, OK, we're going to radically create a transformative economic programme that gets to the heart of many of these issues, and then another party that is saying, oh, you know, we're going to deal with pesky woke students in universities, and maybe we won't allow trans individuals to self-identify their gender. A lot of people, I think, or the majority, would probably pick the economic party.
I don't really think the polling supports you on that. I think we'd like to believe that that's how voters think, but I don't really think it is. The Conservative Party have been very successful in playing up culture war issues to kind of rile up their base, and they're not actually following through. And I think that's really what's going to be playing out in this local election here. We can remember with Operation Red Meat, you know, the Conservative Party trying to distract from their own internal scandals by pushing things like the Rwanda migration plan. But the thing is, they don't actually believe in a lot of these culture war issues. And again, because they're not actually attacking the legislation behind it. So I think really, if Labour wants to have a shot at the government, that's where they should be attacking it. You know, not so much these bread and butter issues and economics. It's too complex. Just hit them where the fieriness is. That's what Blair understood so well. A vision for a new future, not just zombie Thatcherism. It's sad.
I guess, you know, to support that point as well, Brexit, you know, wasn't necessarily about material questions. Actually, you had one side saying that the country was going to economically collapse, that we were all going to be poorer. But those principled questions of sovereignty, democracy, freedom and identity actually really did end up swinging the majority of people. So actually, it could be argued that politicians would be right and sensible to actually engage with some of those thorny cultural issues, because it does seem to also lead voters to support them.
Yeah, of course. I mean, you know, Brexit was about immigration. I think, unfortunately, looking back on it, the Conservative Party, because it refuses to actually attack the meat of the immigration issue, talks about it as if we were all voting Brexit because we really cared about parliamentary sovereignty. That's not why. We might like to believe that's why, but probably only 5 or so people who actually voted for Brexit were doing so because they cared about parliamentary procedure. You know, but voters are, you know, not so worried about polling as Westminster-brained people are. And that's why I just think it's so important to, you know, hit the red meat issues, but also follow through. You know, it's very easy to talk big, you know, talk the talk, talk, Brexit means Brexit. But then if you go back on that legacy and you don't actually fix the problems that caused that referendum to be such a flashpoint in the first place, then, well, things look bad for the Conservative Party, I'd say.
No, I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, now the government has put forward this Rwanda plan, and that has also caused, a big furore and so on. And some people will say, actually, even if it's not a perfect plan, at least they're engaging with those important questions that you raise about immigration and Brexit. And actually, the Labour Party just dismissing it outright as inhumane is still them not really paying attention to why they won or why they lost such a significant defeat in the last election.
I mean, I think it's unfortunate because we know that the Labour Party is kind of, constantly scrambling to think of its own identity and kind of develop something for itself. But the Conservative Party is doing that too. The Rwanda migrant plan could potentially be brilliant, but I have no faith at all in the government actually doing anything about it. Nigel Farage said earlier today about how there's been a lot of talk about, the border crossings have stopped this week. Well, that was the wind. That wasn't the result of the government's policy. If it was a genuine deterrent and if they actually were prepared to follow through on it, then yes, I do think it would have an effect. But I don't believe they're actually... I think they're just going to fall back and say, it's unworkable, but we tried. Well, it's not good enough to just try. Do something.
Well, thank you so much, Poppy Coburn. Writer, thank you for joining me in the studio throughout the show. That's all from us on The Discussion. See you at the same time next week. Up next is Nana Queer.
And looking ahead to this evening's weather, the UK looking rather cloudy with limited sunshine and outbreaks of rain in the west and the southwest. Let's take a look then at the details. A pretty cloudy evening across the southwest of England with patchy rain. The rain heaviest in the north and over the moors, although some brighter spells are possible as well. The southeast of England, mostly cloudy as well, but drier in general, a little light rain possible at times. And for South Wales, a mostly cloudy picture with outbreaks of showery rain, especially in the west. A rather damp end to the day as well there. A cloudy theme to the weather continuing across the Midlands this Sunday. Patchy, mostly light rain, possible at times, but most places remaining dry with some bright spells. There will be a brighter end to the day for the north of east of England, with some sunny spells likely there this evening. The odd shower also possible, but remaining mostly dry for most. And a similar story for southern Scotland this evening. Some sunny spells likely, although most places will be dry. The odd isolated shower